In this video, I'll be putting together one of the rather unique drawers that I made for my kitchen. And I have a total of 3 of these in one base cabinet. And what they do is they hold bottles, like bottles of water is in the top one, which I've already built and installed. You could say that that was my practice one, because I did make a couple of mistakes on it and learn from it, actually. Doesn't matter how many times you do this kind of thing, you're still going to make mistakes and you're still going to learn something. So I've got 2 more of these to make, and I've got the parts laid out here on my table saw workbench. I didn't show where I cut out the parts because it's fairly straightforward. However, I did make a separate video on cutting out these small dividers so that they're exactly the right length to fit in between the dividers. And there's a link in the description to the video where I show how to do that. Anyway, these go together to form a kind of an egg crate type deal with individual cells that are just a little bit more than 3 inches by 3 inches. And to get started on that, I'm going to fasten 5 of the short dividers to what is the side of the drawer. I'm using one of the short dividers as a spacer for this first piece. And then I'll get some glue on the edge and fire in 2 1¼ inch pin nails. This is different from the first one I did. In that one I used brads, which are quite a bit bigger. But the bigger nail is not really needed here. These are just holding it together while the glue dries. And then I can use that spacer again to install the next one. And before I put any of these short dividers in, I'm taking the time to sand the edge just slightly to get rid of any furriness. It would be very difficult to get in there afterwards to sand it. Not that that's a big deal. Since I took the extra time to make sure that I cut out these short dividers very precisely, what I'll end up with after I put the last one in is just enough space for that spacer to fit in to the end of the side like that. And that's fairly critical for the overall success of this. This is where I kind of messed up on the first one. I wasn't as careful cutting out the short divider pieces and wound up having to redo a couple things because of it. The next step is to add the next long piece. And to do that, once again, I've clamped down one of the short dividers so that it spaces that first one properly. And then I'll get some glue on the end of the dividers and put that piece in place. And then once again, I'm driving in some pin nails to hold it while the glue dries. I've also got these short pieces that I cut as spacers to go in there to make sure that the dividers are the right distance apart. It's important when you're putting this together that you always start from the same end and work your way across. And that way any error in spacing will be the same at the other end. So what I've done is I've turned the assembly around so it's facing the other way, and I'm going to start putting in the next row. And once again, I've got my spacer clamped on, and I'm going to get some glue on this first one, and then I'm going to toenail it in. Now, toenailing is kind of an advanced skill with a nail gun, but it doesn't take much practice before you get the hang of it. You just have to be careful because the nail can curve out unpredictably, so you really want to make sure that your fingers are out of the line of fire. And then when all of those dividers are put in, I can add another long divider in exactly the same way. I've got the spacer clamped onto the end, and I'm going to use the small spacers to make sure that the dividers are evenly spaced. Okay, I'm up to the last row of the short dividers, and right about now you're probably saying, wow, this is so tedious. Well, welcome to the world of making stuff. There's generally a lot of repetition involved, especially when you're making something like this. Another thing that you might be saying is, how are you keeping this square? Are you checking it as you go along? And the answer is no, I'm not checking it. The fact is that if you make the cuts square on the parts you're using, it's basically self-squaring. I mean, it can't get that far out. And even if your cuts are slightly off, because this is going together kind of randomly, as in the parts could be oriented any way, that will generally cancel any small error, and you'll wind up with something that's square. To put the last one on, which is the other side actually, I've once again turned the assembly around so that up is facing me. It's very important that the up side of this be all flush, while the bottom side really doesn't matter that much. And even though I'm certain that it is square, it never hurts to check after the thing's put together. And to do that, I'm measuring across corner, and if they're equal, it's square. After I get the first one put together, I put together the second one because I have 2 left to build here, unfortunately. And of course that went a little bit faster because I didn't have to film it. And I gave the glue about an hour to dry on those. And in the meantime, I cut out the solid maple edge banding for the top of these things. And this gave me a good opportunity to use up some offcuts and scraps left over from building the doors. The top of this box is pretty good, but I'm just going to go over it with the sander to make sure that it's absolutely flat. Putting the edge banding on is pretty straightforward, actually. I'm going to start over on one side, put the first piece on, and then I'm going to do what will be the front. And once again, I'm just using glue and pin nails to hold these on. And then the next ones that I put on will be in the middle. And what they'll do is they'll span over those short dividers. And that'll add a little bit of strength. Another benefit is that if the short dividers didn't go in perfectly straight, this will actually make them look straight. So it's a little bit of a trick. Now, it might seem like I've got a lot more tedium ahead of me here to cut these short pieces and fit them in, because you know what the chances are of all these being exactly the same length. It's virtually 0, but it's actually not that bad. What I do is I get the longest measurement, and then I cut 5 to that length, and then I check to see how they fit, and I make adjustments as I go. It winds up taking not very long at all. After I get all the banding strips on, I can quickly sand the top with 220 grit paper. Notice that I'm just hovering over each hole and moving along, similar to what I did when I sanded the plywood itself. And that helps to keep the sanding disc from tearing on the edge. And just to ease over this edge on the inside of each cell, I'm using my sanding file to slightly chamfer the corner. The last thing to do before I can bring these out and spray the finish on is to put some kind of a bottom in there to keep the bottles and cans from falling out. And now I could have went with a full bottom here. That's kind of a waste of material. And also it's not really needed. You just need something, like I said, to keep the things from falling through. So I'm just going to cut strips that go across the middle of each cell and use glue and some 1 1/4 inch brad nails to hold those on. The open bottom also has the benefit of not actually collecting dust and dirt, which can be a problem for something like this. Finally, after all that, last thing to do is to take it out back, where I'm going to spray on a few coats of water-based polyurethane. I'm going to start on the bottom, and here you can see I've driven in some screws to hold the drawer up so I can finish the whole thing all the way around. And there's really only a couple of surfaces on these that I'm looking for a really good finish on, and that's on the top of the grid. That needs to be nice and smooth, and also on the sides. The front will be covered by the drawer front, which will be made later. So after that first coat goes on and I let it dry, I can lightly sand it with 220 grit paper and give it the second coat. And then all I need to do is let that dry at least overnight, and then I can get the drawers installed in the cabinet. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that one, and it gives you some ideas for your own kitchen. Obviously, not everybody has a full cabinet to devote to this kind of storage, but for me, it is a priority, and I went over the reasons for that in a previous video.